Hello and welcome to the Jane's World of Defence podcast for the 13th of November 2019. With me today I have Gabriel Dominguez, our Asia Pacific editor at Jane's Defence Weekly, Nick Forenza, our Europe editor, Jeremy Binney, our Middle East and Africa editor, and then hopefully we'll be patching in from our Washington DC office, Ashley Roki, our LEM reporter there, to talk about our latest US Army programme. To kick off, though, I'm going to talk initially about Turkey and its fighter aspirations. Now, just the background here is Turkey was a full-on member of the US-led F-35 Joint Striker program. They decided they were going to procure a Russian air defense system, the S-400 air defense system, and despite pressure from the United States and NATO, they went ahead with that and were consequently effectively kicked out of the F-35 program. Now, the latest report we have, which is from one of our correspondents, Ruben Johnson, who tracks a lot of what's going on with Russian aerospace developments. And Ruben has reported for us that Turkey are now set to acquire Sukhoi fighters to take the place of the F-35. They also have a very ambitious future fighter program, and it seems like the Su-57, the Sukhoi Su-57, may well take the place of that because the Russians, as well as offering them Su-35s, they have offered the Turks the ability to develop a Turkish-specific Su-57. And those two programs will together take the place of what would have been an F-35 procurement. Now, the interesting thing is, as recently as the 29th of October, the Turkish Defense Minister, Hulusi Akar, was denying any Su-35 deal, maintaining that the Turks were still in the F-35 program. Now, they have an interest to do that. They obviously have put money into this program, and they're going to want reparations for being kicked out of it. But it's interesting to speculate to what extent they really believe that. From what I've read and heard from the Americans, there is no way that the Turks are going to come back into the F-35 program. And so it's a very strange situation here. We've got Turkey that it's a NATO country. It was the bastion of NATO's southern flank, now increasingly set to acquire Russian systems. And the interesting photograph that we used to accompany Ruben's story was a picture from this year's Moscow Air Show, where Russian President Vladimir Putin is alongside the Turkish President, President Erdogan, and they're looking into the cockpit of an Su-57. Now, we didn't write it in this story because it's somewhat crystal ball gazing, but Ruben is of the belief that this deal, that the initial Su-35s for Turkey, followed on by the Turkish-specific Su-57 program, may well get announced at the upcoming Dubai Air Show. So that's an interesting one to watch out for. Now, moving on, Gabriel. We've had quite a few reports from Afghanistan published recently. What is the upshot of those?
Well, Pete, we keep seeing deadly attacks on civilians on an almost daily basis, and it seems the situation for the Afghan forces is not much better. According to the latest reports by the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, also known as SIGAR, the Afghan forces suffered approximately 5% more casualties between June and the end of August than during the same period of the previous year. See, the issue here is that we don't really have access to the actual casualty figures, given that U.S. forces in Afghanistan continue to classify most data related to the Afghan forces. I'm talking here about data such as casualties, performance assessments, and operational readiness levels of the forces. One thing we can say, however, is that the rise in casualties appears to be linked to an increase in the number of so-called enemy-initiated attacks. According to the SIGAR, NATO recorded a 19% increase between June and the end of August in the number of these attacks. Moreover, roughly half of these attacks were considered effective, meaning that they resulted in civilian, coalition, and or Afghan military casualties.
So what are the US and Afghan forces, how are they responding to this?
Well, insurgent casualties have reportedly also been high, with the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stating that U.S. and Afghan operations inflicted 1,000 insurgent casualties between the 28th of August and the 8th of September. Moreover, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani spoke of 2,000 casualties inflicted between the 6th and the 13th of September. However, it is very difficult to independently verify these figures. That said, U.S. forces in Afghanistan have pointed out that the Afghan Special Security Forces have intensified ground operations. At the same time, the U.S. and coalition airstrikes have also been on the rise. In fact, the U.S. Air Force is on track this year to releasing the largest amount of munitions over Afghanistan since at least 2008. An interesting development independently of this is that U.S. Army General Austin Miller, who is the commander of both Resolute Support and U.S. Forces Afghanistan, revealed in late October that the U.S. military has been quietly reducing its troop numbers in Afghanistan over the past year, even without a peace agreement being reached between Washington and the Taliban. This reduction means that U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan are currently at about 13,000, with much of the reduction coming from the U.S. command headquarters in Kabul. Mr. Miller, General Miller, says that he's confident that the Afghan coalition forces have the capability to reach their objectives. And U.S. Secretary of State Mark Esper pointed out in this context that the troop reduction is in line with requests he has made to U.S. commanders to free up time, money, and manpower to put into other priorities outlined in the U.S. National Defense Strategy, with China being priority number one and Russia number two.
Okay, well, yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk about China. It's virtually impossible to talk military geopolitics without talking about China these days. For a while now, the Pentagon has been waking up to the extent to which China is becoming a real peer competitor. So the US military still worries about Russia, of course, but China, as you say, has been designated the prime long-term adversary to worry about. Now, on the 29th of October, Michael Brown, who's the director of the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit, said that the United States is lagging behind China in a number of game-changing dual-use technologies. So what are those technologies, and how does Washington find itself in this position?
Well, Brown said that China is already either competing with the U.S. or setting the pace in 6 technological areas. Those areas include hypersonics, AI or artificial intelligence, quantum sciences, 5G mobile network technology, genetic engineering, and space, all of which are dual-use areas, except for, let's say, hypersonics, meaning that they're not only important for military overmatch, but also for economic prosperity. Brown gave some examples during his speech of China's edge in these areas. He said, for instance, that the U.S. is playing a catch-up game on hypersonics and that Beijing is ahead of Washington in the AI field of facial recognition. He also pointed to China successfully launching the world's first quantum-enabled satellite in 2016 and to the activities of Chinese telecommunications company Huawei in terms of their 5G technology. He also noted that China's goal is to be the technology leader in all areas by 2049. But he warned that such a plan would have implications for the U.S. defense establishment, given that national security and economic security are inextricably linked. More specifically, he said that in the long term, and I quote, "Declining U.S. leadership in science and technology will lead to the loss of U.S. military technical advantage, as well as to Washington having fewer levers to shape global technological norms and state behavior."
Okay, so what's the Pentagon's response to this? Because they cannot control the commercial environment. They can control what's on the military side. The US government can control to some extent what's going on in terms of mergers and acquisitions, Chinese acquisition of various technologies. But when we're talking about the Chinese actually stealing a technological march, as opposed to just acquiring capabilities by buying Western companies, It seems like there's not an awful lot they can do.
Well, let's first take a look at what the Pentagon is saying that China is doing. The Pentagon is saying that Beijing is following a national strategy to acquire critical U.S. technologies through both licit and illicit methods, such as, say, intellectual property theft. In fact, the DIU stated in January that the Chinese investments in emerging technologies had enabled a strategic competitor, such as China, to access what it referred to as the crown jewels of U.S. innovation. So the Pentagon is now looking for ways to stop these practices by getting more R&D funds from Congress, but more importantly, by getting increased support from U.S. industry and academia. So they want U.S. industry to cooperate in putting a stop to these Chinese practices. To show you just how seriously the Pentagon is taking this, Defense Secretary Esper pointed out on 5th November that AI has the potential to transform warfare in all of the domains, which is why the Pentagon has placed the development of AI-related capabilities at the top of the list of technologies it needs, closely followed by directed energy weapons and hypersonics. Esper said that for the U.S. to get where it needs to be with AI, it needs to basically involve academia and industry, and to have the government and all three of them pulled together like it did during the Second World War. Because, and I quote Esper here, whichever nation harnesses AI first will have a decisive advantage on the battlefield for many, many years.
Okay, well, you can't argue with that. Gabriel, thank you. Okay, Nick, the Bundeswehr celebrated its 64th anniversary on the 12th of November. And so we had a public swearing in of 400 soldiers, and that's the first time that's happened in 6 years, apparently. Now, what's going on with Germany at the moment? Because with the new defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, she's looking for Germany to step up somewhat, is she not, in terms of defense and security?
Yeah, she's quite full of interesting ideas to get Germany to be more active on the world scene. 5 days before the anniversary of the Bundeswehr, she addressed the Bundeswehr University in Munich and called for Germany to have a greater ability to act, using the German compound noun Handlungsfähigkeit. And basically what she's saying is that Germany should be more active in defense and security in the face of what she calls Russian aggression in Ukraine, and especially the illegal annexation of Crimea, her words. Also in the face of terrorism, the rise of China, climate change, threats from the cyber domain, and demographic change as the US and UK newly define their roles. She's called for the domestic political decision-making process to be accelerated. So she's actually proposed that Germany's Federal Security Council be turned into a National Security Council to coordinate diplomatic, military, economic, trade, internal security, and development instruments. Moreover, she wants the Bundeswehr to remain a parliament army answering to the Bundestag, which she believes will give combat deployments, quote, special democratic legitimacy, unquote. She's suggested that legitimate deployments could be accelerated to give Germany an efficient and reliable ability to act, to which a robustly equipped Bundeswehr would contribute. This was, in fact, a week after she had proposed a Syria peacekeeping force with Bundeswehr participation, but this received a cool reception from Germany's NATO European allies during NATO ministerial in Brussels, and also faced heavy criticism at home.
The Germans they deployed in the Balkans, didn't they?
Yes.
I think that possibly was that one of the first times they'd actually fired shots in anger in an international deployment, perhaps, back in...
Yes, it would have been in the Balkans, that's right.
Yeah, and of course the Germans were in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
So where is the reticence coming from, given that it has been normalized that German forces will deploy internationally?
Well, in fact, I don't even know whether it's accurate to say that those deployments are popular. Germany is actually still quite a pacifist nation, or at least a large part of the population is. So they've always had to struggle with these deployments. I mean, in Afghanistan, I don't think they ever admitted that it was a combat deployment, although their soldiers were involved in combat and they did suffer casualties. So there is this domestic opposition. One thing that's interesting is that Karrenbauer basically now gave a timeline for reaching the 2% of GDP.
Well, that in itself is interesting, isn't it? Because 2% of German GDP is not an inconsiderable sum.
No, and even the 1.3% that has been spending now is, given that it's the largest economy in the Europe and one of the largest economies in the world, that actually does by quite a bit. But in any case, they're talking about reaching 1.5% of GDP by 2024. This is her predecessor had said this before, but for the first time, the 2% has been mentioned, or at least the timeline for the 2% has been mentioned. But this will be no later than 2031, according to Karrenbauer, which in fact is 6 years later than the NATO is aiming. But in fact, if you look at the spending with the increase also in German GDP, they have, despite the 1.2, 1.3% of GDP spending, they have been raising defense spending steadily since 2017. The Germans call this the Trendwende, so the turnaround in spending. So if we look at the 2017 figures, they're 37 billion euros. That rose steadily to 43.2 billion in 2019, and the current budget is proposed by the German government, which still needs to be approved by the Bundestag, the parliament, is 44.9 billion. And Germany, the Ministry of Defense is expecting this to have a major impact on the equipment of the Bundeswehr to be a modern force. In fact, one of the priority programs they're looking at the extra funding paying for is to prepare the German-led NATO Response Force Very High Readiness Joint Task Force for 2023 to be a modern, digitalized force with the most modern vehicles and infantry equipment. So the Puma infantry fighting vehicle is being upgraded. It is being fixed so that it can be receive equipment for the digitalization. It's being made more able to operate with soldiers using Infanterist der Zukunft, future soldier equipment. And then also the extra spending is expected to be used for other high priority programs. So the replacement of the CH-53 helicopter, which is a Vietnam War era design, at least, with a new schwere Transporthubschrauber. They're looking at investing in the MK as 180 multipurpose combat ship, participating in the European program to develop a male remotely piloted aircraft system, a second batch of Puma infantry fighting vehicles. They're also on the verge, apparently, of approving more Leopard tanks. So Germany would actually have over 400 tanks of the latest, or one of the latest standards, the Leopard 2 A7 standard. And also they're looking at replacing Tranche 1 Eurofighter combat aircraft.
Okay, so that is quite some way from literally just a few years ago when they were talking about German readiness, for example, being right on the floor.
Yeah, for this VJTF, the NATO Response Force, Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, which they're actually leading this year too, they actually had to draw on equipment and personnel from other units in the Bundeswehr, whereas now the Panzer Grenadier Brigade 37, which will lead the VJTF in 2023, will actually be properly equipped in its own right.
Nick, thank you very much.
Do you spend too much time collecting and processing open source information? Do you struggle to verify this information? At Janes, we deliver cutting-edge, trusted open source intelligence on current, emerging, and future threats and assessments of the capabilities you need to mitigate them. Janes is the only single resource for comprehensive, structured, and connected intelligence on military equipment, inventories, and orders of battle, which means we can help you reveal previously hidden connections. We also provide data and insight on conventional and asymmetric threats, including terrorism, extremism, and organized crime. So if you are struggling and tired of trying to develop open source intelligence with the overwhelming volumes of inconsistent and unstructured data, let us help reduce your workload. Janes assesses, validates, and verifies huge amounts of data, and then adds the insight you need to focus your resources. Visit janes.com/milcaps, that's MILCAPS, to find out more.
Okay, Jeremy. Now, what you're going to talk about here is a bit of an IMINT anomaly, if I could put it like that, imagery intelligence anomaly. Occasionally, we look at satellite pictures. Quite often, in fact, we find some very interesting things. Now, tell me about this one from Eastern Libya.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pete. So we've known for a few years now, and I think we broke the story that the UAE was using an airbase, or had set up an airbase at an airstrip called Al-Qadim in eastern Libya. And this has sort of been back in the news recently with the leaked reports from the UN panel of experts that monitors the arms embargo on Libya, identifying that base and Al Jufra Air Base as deployment locations for Mirage 2009 strike jets. Now, the report seemingly doesn't say who is operating the Mirages in Libya, but the UAE is the only one that operates the 2009 variant, so that seems a little bit moot. But so what we are seeing at both these locations now is that Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries have been set up there. Now, these appear to have the new sort of Sentinel radars, which is the latest configuration for quite an old air defense system. Doesn't necessarily mean they're from the UAE. They could potentially be Egyptian, which also backs the Libyan National Army faction. But I think what is interesting here is the one at Al Jufra was set up in April and totally failed to prevent an airstrike on that airbase in late July. Now, the government National Accord claimed to have carried that out, the airstrike. They didn't provide too many details of how they did it. We're presuming it was actually done with one of the Bayraktar TB2 UAVs that Turkey has deployed in support of the GNA, because there was a very small and precise hole punched in the top of one of the hangars there. That airbase is, so Al Jufra airbase is around 360 kilometers from Misrata, which is probably the closest location the Bayraktars could fly from. That's actually further than the Bayraktar's communication radius, but it's possible that they forward deployed a control station so they could carry out that strike. But I think the really strange thing is Al-Qadim is 580 kilometers from Misrata. So that's really quite a long way. It's way beyond the range of the L-39 jets that the GNA is still flying from Misrata Air Academy. So
what is the threat?
What is the threat? We don't know at this stage. There's nothing known that could reach that far in Western Libya. So does the UAE think that there is now a long-range strike UAV being deployed in support of the GNA or some other asset? We don't know, but we will keep monitoring that situation.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you.
Ashley, I just wanted to revisit the optionally manned fighting vehicle situation with regard to the US Army. We had reported in the wake of the AUSA exposition in DC that exactly wasn't going as planned. And, well, it's a strange one, really, because obviously modern defense systems are much, much more complex than they used to be. If you look at the situation in the Second World War, for example, a lot of the major powers involved in that conflict started it out with at least a few biplanes in their inventories. And yet by 1943, the UK, the Americans, and certainly the Germans have jet fighters flying around. So it's amazing how technology was actually put into the front line in that era. These days, it's not so much like that, but with the US effort on the Bradley replacement, there was an effort, was there not, to try and make things happen a bit faster. And now they've kind of fallen foul of actually trying to go that way and caught themselves between a rock and a hard place. And this, of course, isn't the first time that this has come unstuck, because trying to replace the Bradley, first of all, we had the Future Combat Systems program of decades ago that wasted billions, went nowhere. The Ground Combat Vehicle program that wasted a lot of money, went nowhere. And now they are stuck somewhat with their current situation. So can you just take me through the latest of what is going on with that program?
Yes. So just as sort of a brief recap, those FCS and the ground combat vehicle fell flat. And then about 2 years ago, Army leadership announced plans to try to pick it up again under the Next Generation Combat Vehicle umbrella that was placed under the new Futures Command, which is sort of an effort to accelerate fielding for the Army. So they decided to move out on the optionally manned fighting vehicle effort under a rapid prototyping effort. So then fast forward to January of this year. There's about 6 companies saying that they're interested at that point. Come January, the Army releases its draft request for proposal. And they took industry feedback, and General Kaufman, who is the director of Next Generation Combat Vehicle, sort of walked reporters through some of the difficult choices they had to make, such as saying, okay, armor might be a problem when it comes to weight and getting 2 on a C-17. So let's make it an armor package or coupon that you sort of like strap on. They also decided that the 30 millimeter cannon would be the threshold, with a plan to get to the 50 millimeter cannon that they would need to fight on the future battlefield. So then March, the final RFP hits the street. And at this point, we're down to BAE Systems, General Dynamics Land Systems, and a team made up of Raytheon Rheinmetall. So these 3 companies are vying for it, and they have until October 1st to deliver a bid sample, which is the vehicle, and the armor coupon, which is the strap-on armor. What happens at this time is that several of these companies raise concerns up the Army chain, saying, hey, we have some challenges with having 15 months to deliver a non-developmental platform for you, and then 2 on a C-17, saying, hey, this is okay right now, but with what you want in growth, that's going to be a problem down the road. So according to multiple sources, the acquisition community sort of agreed that this was a challenge on the requirements front, but they were ultimately overruled. By June, BAE Systems has announced that it's dropping out of the competition, citing requirements and the actual acquisition schedule, that it just doesn't meet what their plans are.
Right.
So at that point, the Raytheon Rheinmetall team, they request a delay. They want to deliver their bid sample December 1st and their armor coupon February 1st. The Army comes back with no. So come late August, they drop out of the competition for 2 weeks. During that time, it's not clear what has happened, but the Army goes back to that team and convinces them to rejoin the competition. At that point, the team asks for a 30-day extension to get their bid sample to the Army. And their bid sample is the Lennox, and it's stuck in Germany at this point. The Army says sort of deliver whatever you can to us, but that doesn't help get their permits to get it out of the country again. So come October 1st, they deliver their paperwork, but not their bid sample. And they are immediately disqualified for the competition, which only leaves GDLS within the competition. The Army has said, okay, the Army has until next March to make a decision on awarding a prototyping contract. They said if they do only award one prototyping contract, that's okay, because other companies can hop back in later on when there's a low rate initial production contract. Problem is, some people place it around $200 million that would be on the backs of companies of their own money to get in at the LRIP point. And then also each company would be disadvantaged without having any access to government information at that point. So it's unclear what's going to happen right now. There's multiple options. One, it's unclear what the GD bid is, and if the
We don't even know what that is, do we? We haven't even seen it.
We have not seen it. They have not. They've provided some details of it, but they haven't even provided a name of what they're calling it. But they have said it's clean sheet design, so it could place the Army at a disadvantage if it doesn't work. So that's all speculative at this point, though. So the Army could go forward with one prototyping contract. It might not, and it might have to restart. If it does go forward with one prototyping contract, some have suggested that the Army could potentially award light contracts. And then you also have Congress, who is not going to be happy with the lack of competition when you've already had these 2 failed programs before. There's multiple avenues for them to try and reinsert competition as well.
Okay, well that sounds crazy. I mean, they've got one horse in the race, and they don't even know if they like the look of that horse. It doesn't look promising at this point. But Ashley, thank you very much for that update. We'll keep a close eye on that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's all we've got time for. Thanks to Jeremy, Gabriel, Nick, and Ashley for taking part today. Thanks, as always, to Josh Wales for producing, and thank you for listening.